How would you define that? 30 seconds. How would you define pugnacious?
I guess off the cuff, kind of obnoxious and overbearing and kind of Joe-ish maybe.
This is the One Accord Podcast, and today we're talking about elders, church leadership, talking about deacons. Pretty important topic of discussion for a lot of different reasons, sometimes in an unexpected way. And maybe you're watching this and say, oh, not church leadership. I'm not an elder. I'm not a deacon. Well, it's really important for you as well. And so we hope that you'll be edified by this episode. But before we get into it, we've got our normal team, Greg, Eric. How you guys doing today?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm fantastic.
Great, fantastic. Eric, can you beat that or?
No.
No, all right.
Not even close.
Yeah.
No, but I'm good. I'm good. I'm better now that I'm with you guys.
Well, I'll take that. I wish sometimes our theological discussions were so easy to be so definitive. No, it's just not. I'm not better than that. No, that's well, it's good to see you both this morning. I also am a little bit better than I was now that I see your smiling faces. And we're here to talk about a topic that, of course, is very important. You guys have either currently or in the past have served in this role of elder. And so for me to you first, just thank you for doing that. I know that it is an important office. I know that comes with sacrifice. I know that your family, I'm sure, made sacrifices or is continuing to make sacrifices to make that possibility. And often it is thankless. For sometimes the reward for your sacrifices simply that you get criticized and all other sorts of other lovely things that can happen in church leadership. So thank you for your service to Christ's body in this role. Church leadership is one of these things that is incredibly important, but often isn't thought about until it becomes a problem. I don't know if you guys have experienced that, but and sometimes, recently there's been seemingly a string of pastoral moral failures, some well-known people that are coming out of leadership because of various reasons, and we say, okay, here's why elder qualities matter. That's true, but I would add something that people don't even think about very often. And I've said this before, and sometimes it gets people to roll their eyes because it just seems like it's obvious. But, leadership leads. And so whether you're in leadership or not, if you attend a local church, you are being led somewhere. And in some of these cases, the biggest problem that leadership has isn't a moral failure. It's that they have been judged or assessed by some other qualifications, and as a result, now they're just leading in the wrong direction. And what I mean by that is, in many cases, we have substituted biblical qualifications for something like, well, you need to have a degree, you need to have had some success in business. If you've run a successful business, you must be able to run the church. And so then we become kind of this pastor as a CEO type model, and the elders as a board of a corporation type model. And then maybe the only thing that matters is, are we hitting the budget? Are the dollars increasing? Is the square footage of the campus increasing? And we're judging based on worldly criteria rather than spiritual criteria. And for some people, they might be in a situation like that for their entire Christian life, and they never realize anything's wrong because they're judging based on the wrong criteria. So I kind of put that out as an initial thought that no matter who you are, whether you're in church leadership, thinking about being in church leadership, or you have no plans to ever be in church leadership, but you attend church and you're under leadership, how can we properly evaluate the people who are leading? Because quite frankly, they're leading us somewhere. So what do you guys think about that? You think I've stated it too strongly? Should we only be worried about moral failures? Or do you think I'm adding at least some other aspect that makes this immediately relevant to everybody who attends any church in any place?
Yeah, I can't see how it wouldn't be relevant, right? You say you're being led, and you truly are. I mean, someone or some group of someone's is leading. And now let's face up to the fact that it might not be the pastor, it might not be the elders. I've experienced the churches that are run by the little old ladies of both genders, and the old churchmen who treat this like their private country club. We've all seen that, right, to some degree or another. So somebody's leading, and so that might be leading you to stay right where you're at. It might be leading you down a bad path, but praise God, it might be leading you down a good path. So, if someone's leading, who ought that be? How ought they be doing it? And by what standard should we judge who's fit to do it? I think is, as far as I'm concerned, is it's a question of first importance.
Yeah, well said. When I was in seminary, one of my professors kind of prepared us, as we were getting close to graduating and being ready to go out on the, the circuit, putting out your resume and trying to get the job, be called to a church. He said, just be aware that as you're being evaluated, you need to be evaluating them and realize that there's a church government on paper.
Yeah.
And then there's the real church government. And that one doesn't necessarily appear until maybe you upset the wrong person or
Amen.
Until you've been there for a while. But as much as possible, he was trying to get us to try and understand that more hidden dynamic, because that's where the real power is.
If they're too quick to hire you, they might not be the right church for you.
That's possibly true if they're just desperate to get whoever's got a beating heart and is able to stand on their own 2 feet. But no, it is funny how, somebody, whether they drop a big check or they've been around for a long time or whatever, that there can be an unseen power force that completely bypasses all of the official leadership structures for sure. But Eric, what about you? You got any thoughts to add to this before we kind of get into what the Bible actually says about what the qualifications are and what we should be looking for church leaders? But any other additional comments or thoughts that you've got setting the table for us here?
Not really anything different. I'm in agreement with what you guys said. It's who the leadership are in a church is of the utmost importance. And Paul told Timothy, that people need to meet these expectations. They need to meet this criteria. And the criteria that he gave was not, it wasn't necessarily consistent with the criteria that churches today use. I hope that more churches are taking the qualifications for elders seriously. And as you said, Joe, oftentimes it's not the character that's being evaluated. It's I guess you could call it the worldly success. Has the person successfully led a business? Have they made profit in that business or whatever? Something like that. And that's just not the standard to use. The Bible gives us some pretty specific instructions. Although, as we try and flesh all this out today, it's some of the qualifications are not as crystal clear as maybe we would want, but they're definitely clear enough where we can come to some good conclusions.
Yeah, they are clear enough that they should not be ignored or usurped. I think that is for sure. And I don't know, most of the job descriptions that I've ever read or seen, it seems like they, at least somewhere along the lines, have like a bullet point on there that says, and must meet these qualifications. But then there's all this other stuff, and so, the kind of overall picture for what it is we're looking for in our leader isn't just someone who meets these, as if these aren't important enough to really define our leaders. I think if we would take these things seriously, that we would have no shortage if we actually find qualified people to fit these biblical criteria. Their success in business or some other endeavor really doesn't matter. Although it is interesting, spoiler alert, success in their family matters a great deal, and that's one thing that we should be evaluating. But before we get into the individual particulars, let's kind of start a little bit broader. So we've set the table, kind of every church. But now let's get to a particular local church. I remember studying in seminary, studying theology, kind of looking at different views. One of the areas where they said, there's an awful lot of divergence of opinion, and you can still be, orthodox and within the realm of evangelicalism in all of these various forms of church government. And it was kind of asserted over and over again that the Bible does not have a form of church government, that there are multiple forms of church government that are certainly allowable. And I had no issue with that when I was studying. It sure seemed, it made sense to me. The Presbyterians have one form of government, the Baptists have another. And certainly that seemed like that was perfectly fine. Do you guys agree with that, or would you push back against that? Do you think that the Bible mandates a particular type of church leadership? If so, why and what is it? If it doesn't, how loose can we really be? Like, are there some bounds? Like, there's Baptists and Presbyterians okay, but Episcopalians are out of bounds or something like that. What do you think, Greg?
Yeah, I want to be careful with the word mandate, right? I see nowhere in Scripture where it says, thou shalt have this form of government in your churches. But what I do see is a clear and universal picture of what it looks like to have churches led by elders. And again, I think it's my interpretation that we get enough definition and example of what an elder is and ought to be doing. We've got enough to be going on with. It's a little spoiler for later in the conversation. I don't think deacons are leadership. I don't think deacons are in charge. But so let's set aside deacons. But as far as elder governed local bodies, what that means, who they are, the fact that there ought to be a plurality of them. Now, when it comes to, as far as I understand, the differences between Baptist and Presbyterian on a meta level, I think looks a little bit more like one main pastor versus equality amongst the elders, and that probably differs from church to church. So what the differences are between the ecclesiastical structures of Baptists and Presbyterians, I probably couldn't give you. If there is this is the broad, and they all kind of scatter after that, I guess I'm not sure what that is besides a more pastor-led versus more elder-led, elder-ruled.
My understanding of that, and again, not that we're not here to define the differences between like Presbyterians and Baptists, but I think most Baptist churches recognize both the office of pastor and deacon, and then they will have pastors, and they will have deacons, and then those kind of are almost like a check and balance to each other. And many Baptist pastors, I would think, maybe not on paper, but at least in practice, the deacons are basically like his boss. They're kind of like the board to the CEO kind of a thing.
So if that's historically true, I know that's surely not true in all cases today. I'm a member of a Baptist church. Yeah. It is elder led. We do have deacons. Deacons, I think, would be acknowledged as leadership, but the pastor and the elders in no way answer to the deacons by any means.
That sounds more biblical in your case, and so I'm glad for that. I've known other Baptist congregations that are exactly as I've described, and it's not.
And that's where I think
healthy.
I don't know where the clear divide is between the Presbyterian and the Baptist, but once you get whatever that divide is, once you get into those camps, I think you're going to find quite a variance.
In the Presbyterians, though, I think they'd agree with you. Presbyteros is elders. You're never going to have less than one elder, so you're going to have an elder board. Whereas I think it's possible to have, in fact, many Baptist churches, if they have a singular pastor, they have one elder, and then they have deacons. And so there wouldn't be a plurality.
My Baptist context, that's definitely not the case. So we if that is the main differential, we look more like Presbyterians than we do Baptists, even though we are
more. I think Baptists they're more independent, and so they're not really defined. It's difficult to quantify, and so maybe I picked a bad. I was just throwing.
No, it's a good place to go. But again, I think we've spread so far away from whatever our historical differences were that the lines are pretty blurred at this point.
Yeah. No, I don't want to say, and it certainly wasn't my intent, so I'll apologize if I'm the one that kind of started bringing. This isn't an examination of particular denominations and trying to do that. We want to just say, like, what does the Bible say? And for most people, especially that I've talked to, they just say all of those are fine, whether you're Baptist or Presbyterian. Those are all biblically valid. They fit within the general framework that's there. They're not kind of so far out of bounds that that there's anything wrong. And I guess just for clarity, would you say that, like, whatever, Baptist, Presbyterians, as long as there is a plurality of elders, as long as the deacons aren't bossing everybody around because they've somehow usurped the role, those are biblically valid, and then we're at least in the ballpark of a biblically valid and endorsed church government structure.
I can tell you that when I was looking for a church for my family, the only places that I would go were an elder-led congregation. Now, because that's what I understand the Bible to teach. I wouldn't want to be putting my family into a pastor-led. So if if my actions tell you what I believe, that there's what they say. Would I want to say that in no case ever could? Yeah, God does different things in different churches. But if I were to be setting up what a healthy biblical church looks like, I believe the only thing that I could set up in good conscience would be a plurality of elders. Maybe that's 2, maybe that's 5. I don't see any definition of that necessarily, but yeah.
That's fair. Eric, what about you? Do you think that the Bible mandates a particular type of church government, or do you think that it is a little bit more open and that there are multiple forms of government that might be applicable or allowable or beneficial even, depending on the context? And then, is there, if it is open-ended, how open-ended is it? Like, I mean, does anything go? Can any kind of church government be okay as long as you have qualified people in the seats, or are there some parameters? Kind of how do you view it? Kind of big picture. It's a broad topic. So, but kind of what guidelines or protective guardrails would you put up?
Well, there are certain things that we can rule out. I don't think it's biblical to have one person leading a church. And like in Acts 14, verse 23, it says, when they had appointed elders for them in every church, having prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. It says that they had appointed elders, plural, in every church. So this was a normal practice to appoint a plurality of elders in the church. If they did that for all the churches, then we can rightly assume that is what's expected for every church. Now, as far as deacons, we can talk more about this when we actually get into what a deacon is. As I understand a deacon, I don't believe a deacon has the same role as an elder. I think deacons and elders are different things. They're different offices. This is a very profound thought, but an elder is an elder and a deacon is a deacon. So I know that blew your mind just now, but these are just two different things. And if you look at the qualifications, while they're similar, they're not identical. And I think that elders and deacons are distinct things. And as we get to those, the specifics of each, we can flesh all that out.
Yeah, we will intend to try and define the differences between those, because certainly the differences, while recognized, sometimes functionally, there are many churches that you might go to that functionally you can't really tell the difference between these things. Sometimes the title is deacon, but really that seems like the function they're performing is what I would understand to be more of an elder, and the elder or elders are doing something completely different than anything that I think the scriptures are saying. I'm with you. I've heard people that would say, you don't have to have a plurality of elders, that do hold to the more senior pastor model, or again, sometimes it's Baptist. I've talked to a lot of different Baptists in a lot of different places, and it certainly isn't representative of everybody. Greg, as you're saying, your Baptist context is different, than what I'm describing now. So I'm not intending to paint every Baptist in this way or whatever, but there are many churches that do have kind of that singular pastor model, that no matter what their paper says, we're talking about the what is the real government. This guy functions as the singular leader of that local body, and as a result of that, they'll look at passages and what you just read from Acts 14. They said, well, they went and appointed elders in every church, but what they're talking about is plurality of churches, so that what they did is they put a singular leader in every single place. There are some who would say, well, the elders is one role. That's presbyteros in the Greek, but then the overseer or the bishop, the episkopos, is something that is that singular overseer. And so they'll try and make a distinction. Okay, just like you said, elders are one thing, deacons are something. Well, elders and overseers are different things, and they'll point to the fact that sometimes in the scriptures, in fact, very, very commonly in the scriptures, elders occurs in the plural, as you're saying, but the overseer is articular and singular. So the overseer is supposed to be this. Do you think that those passages indicate, James is sometimes pointed out as being the leader of the Jerusalem Council, for example. That means that he was the pastor. He was the guy. Do you think that, in the biblical accounting, even if there is a plurality of elders, that there is like a chief among the elders, something that maybe some would call the overseer or the episcopos, the bishop, the pastor? Or do you view elders as being all on the same kind of level, and that, you would seek to not elevate one individual above the rest? Because that's at least related, I think, to some of the things that you guys are saying. So just a follow-up to what you've already stated.
Yeah, as I read the text, now again, we can make it say whatever we want, right? Like if we wanted to say because James was in charge of a council, he is automatic. We must assume he's a pastor. You can make it say that if you want. That's not what it says, though. It is my understanding as I read through Scripture and I see how elder and overseer are interchangeable within an idea. It is my understanding that elders are all playing in the same sandbox. They all have the same general responsibilities of leading the church. Now, we do see that some take on the obligations of teaching, some focus perhaps on the on areas of particular oversight, but I see nowhere in Scripture where we are shown or taught that the pastor is the uber elder or uber overseer or anything like that.
That's a good word, uber. I like that word.
Well, I was going to say ubermensch. I was going to go back to the old Superman. But that's the way it often is, right? It's like, you'll hear it said, and they try to make it nicer, and I suppose to some degree it is. It's how is it said? It's something like a senior among equals, or
chief among equals.
Chief among equals. Yeah. First, there you go. First among equals is what I hear, and I go, I don't know. I think I'd be careful painting it with that broad brush. Just because you possess or you've been given the responsibility of teaching, does that make you first? I don't know. I don't personally see it that way. We have some elders, God love them. I don't think they're ever going to stand up and preach. That's okay. We don't need 50 or 5 preachers in our church. I think we need more than one. I think we need more. I think because here's, I'm gonna show a little bit of my cards here. For the most part, except for a few very particular instances, when we look at the qualifications of elder, I don't see this, like, again, this ubermensch, this person who's achieved this great and awesome thing. I see, as I read through the qualifications that we'll get to, I see mature Christian man who has been given particular abilities in teaching, so for the most part, when I look at an elder, I go, here is a mature Christian man. That's the qualification. So
I think that's well said. Eric, you view it differently. Do you vote for the ubermensch? I like it. I'm going to have a hard time not saying that often.
Well, let me start by saying I think that an overseer and an elder is the same thing. I think these are synonyms. In Titus chapter 1, Paul says, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. Namely, if any man is above reproach, the husband of one wife, having children, and who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion." And then he says, "For the overseer must be above reproach as God's steward, not self-willed," and so on and so forth. So it seems to me like he's saying these are elders. But then he says, for the overseer. When he says for the overseer, he's talking about the elder. The elder is the overseer. Now, he does mention one, but that doesn't mean that there's only one in each church. He's just describing what each elder should be like, what their qualifications are to be. That's the way I look at it. And in 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter says something similar. 1 Peter 5, I think it's verses 1 and 2, where Peter says, "Therefore I exhort the elders among you, as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntary, according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain, but with eagerness." So he tells the elders to oversee the church. So it seems to me that in the New Testament that an elder and an overseer are the same thing, because an elder oversees the flock. To make a distinction between these two, I think doesn't seem to be consistent with what Scripture says. So I take elder and overseer to be the same thing.
Yeah, and that's why I said I think the Bible treats those terms as interchangeable within the same idea.
Yep.
Why does this one have interchangeable terms if elder and deacon are not?
Where can you give an example of where within the same idea elder and deacon are?
No, but I mean, some people would say, well, I mean, the argument was, well, they're different terms, so they're different things, right? That was the mind-blowing statement that was made. So here we have now we have different terms that refer to the same thing. So why have differing terms?
Well, I mean, the first and most obvious answer is, as we dig into the text, we see, for instance, in 1 Timothy 3, clear expectations for the overseer, which again, if our position is correct, it's interchangeable with elder. And then he goes on and says, now deacons must be this. So the text treats it, differentiates it. So it's only logical to also differentiate it in practice.
I'm just asking why would there be two terms that mean the same thing here that are used within similar contexts? What's the point of having two words? Why would God inspire us to talk about elders and overseers? Why not just one term?
Well, I think that the overseer maybe more so describes what they're doing. The elder is it's the individual, because like Peter said, an elder must carry out oversight. So oversight is what the elder is doing. I think overseer more so describes, like, is it the verb, the action, whereas the elder is the individual. And I think that's doing the action. And I think what Greg said was important, because the way that you read 1 Timothy 3, it sounds like he's saying, okay, here's the qualifications for an elder, and then here's some other qualifications for a deacon. And if you read the qualifications, they're not identical. For example, an elder is supposed to be able to teach. A deacon does not necessarily have to be able to teach. There's a difference in the qualifications, and there's a difference in what they do.
That's a good question, though, Joe. I've never had someone ask me the question, why would God inspire two different terms talking about one person, but not wrap that up into another? I don't know that sitting here I have a great answer for why God chose to inspire the authors to provide two terms for the same office, but not include the third term in it. Again, the third term being completely differentiated, at least as I read the text, and the other two terms being interchangeable. I don't have a good answer for that.
I think Eric's given a good answer, and I'm glad to be able to, at least for the sake of conversation, ask. I'm in agreement with you guys. I think that they are used interchangeably. I think Eric, you gave probably the two best texts. I would add a third, which I include in with that same category in Acts chapter 20. Paul calls for the elders to come and meet, and then when they do, he says he tells them to shepherd the flock. God has made them overseers. So there are these three passages in particular demonstrate to me that they are speaking of the same people and the same role. I've heard, some, just as I wrestle through this, I think about it. I've heard some other people have wrestled through it and think about it, that maybe it's more of a Jewish conception and a Gentile conception, and because in the church now we're bringing both of these things together. The Greeks were familiar with an episkopos; they had that type of an office, and the Jews were already familiar with elders, and so now you're bringing them together, and you're using both terminology when talking to the church, and you're kind of uniting these roles and functions into one particular place.
It's possible.
I've also it seems at least reasonable and like a fair explanation. There's other similar to what Eric was saying, that the function or the role is of overseeing. An elder then speaks more of the status or the qualifications title. Or the title. In our particular day and age, it's common to have young people who are elders, but I think for them they often had older people who were elders. They tended to, especially in the Jewish culture, revere those who had attained age. They didn't think that they were stupid and worthless. They thought that they were, valuable, and age was something that was praiseworthy. And so, the idea of kind of blending them together in that regard. And so I was just asking the question just again, because I know that some of the newer, the idea that elders and bishops were the same office, I think, was not really questioned until somewhat recently in church history, and then modern scholarship has really started to distinguish between them and make them separate offices. And one of the reasons is because, well, they're two different terms, and so God is he's using one term for one thing and another term for another thing. And an episkopos is or a bishop or an overseer is a special type of elder, but it is kind of elevating them to a different position within the elder group. Maybe that chief among equals kind of an idea. I'm not persuaded by that. I just for the sake of anybody watching, it's good to kind of put those things on the out there. And anytime we're speculating when God doesn't tell us exactly what it is, now we're making an argument from silence. We're kind of coming up with reasons of why it might be that God used these words rather than other words. But I think when we look at the words that He uses, Acts 20, Titus 1, 1 Peter 5, those three passages in particular show us that God inspires these words to be used in the same context, talking about the same people, and doesn't seem to be elevating anybody above anybody else. It's saying that the group of elders, each individually, must meet this criteria. Eric, you said that before. I'm just repeating what you said, and I think you stated it right on. The group itself has this function, but each individual member of that group must meet the criteria individually, and so that makes sense of why that's plural to singular, and I don't have any reason to go beyond that for me.
And that's just such a plain reading, right? Like, let's say I was posting a job I need to hire a group of engineers. Yeah. Well, an engineer must be this. Well,
the engineer suited for this role will have this degree and this kind of experience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yep. Eric, did we cut you off? Did you have something else you were planning on?
No, that was it.
So I believe that they're the same. I think that we've hit the main text. So anytime you see episkopos or presbyteros in the Greek, overseer, bishop, elder, these are speaking of the same role and the same function. We did say that we're all in agreement that elders and deacons are different, and so you've already mentioned some of the qualifications, Eric. That ability to teach isn't part of that qualification. Greg, you said earlier you think that the roles are different. You don't even think, you said that deacons are really, what did you say? You don't think that they're leadership? Sure. Well, tell us more about how you would define the difference.
Yeah. And I'm saying that in response to a lot of current, church controversy where we're arguing whether or not women should be deacons. And now there's good textual reasons why we need to discuss that. But I think where a lot of us fall short is we have gotten into the idea that deacons are, again, on the same level, or maybe have a different sandbox, but that sandbox is equally leading. I don't see anywhere in the text where deacons have a leading the body, in charge of overseeing the body, And so I think it's my opinion that if we put deacons mentally into their proper role, the idea that there might be female deacons resolves itself because they aren't in leadership. They're not, directing the body in any way. So they aren't exercising authority over the body. Therefore, they could potentially serve as deacons. So, we don't get a great. There is much more about the role and function of elders than there is about deacons. And now I know that a lot of people, when we think of deacons, we think of the seven, right? The seven that were appointed to wait the tables. And perhaps those seven were kind of the proto-deacons, the first deacons. Now, unfortunately, that is a leap that we have to make. The Bible doesn't tell us that the seven, which it only refers to as the seven, we're making a jump and a conclusion that says, those were the first deacons. And so if they were great. But again, those seven weren't ever in charge, exercising authority. They were there serving, exactly what the name implies. So that's my differentiation. I do not see deacons as authoritative figures. I don't see the text showing that, and I think they're there to serve. They're there to, however that looks in an individual body's need.
So if they're not leadership, what's the point of having a title? And I think I understand conceptually what you're talking about, but and let's set the seven aside even for now. Deacons is a term that we've seen. There are qualifications that these people must meet, often in the same category of, or at least in the same context. We're talking about descriptions for elders. Deacons have to meet these same type of criteria. If they're not,
they are office bearers. They do have a title, and I agree that these are people set aside and endowed with given particular responsibilities. But I don't see the exercising authority, the leadership being a deacon role. I don't see where that's at in the text. So if it's there, please show me. But I think we talk about the name of overseer describing the function. I think we should carry. I like that idea. I think it's good. I think we ought to carry that to deacon. What is the word? What is that servant name mean? That minister name mean?
So can I restate it and tell me if you would agree with this? So They're not exercising authority, but they are given authority to be faithful in the tasks that have been assigned to them by the people in authority, like elders.
Way better way to say it than I said it. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. Okay. So that's the concept that you're describing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So these are recognized people that have that are faithful, but they're not going and making decisions. They're kind of executing the decisions that have been made by the decision makers.
Yeah. No. Way more succinct way to put it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I just want to, I make sure I'm understanding. It's your thought. I'm just rewording.
Well, you think it better, so yeah. It should be your thought instead.
I'm gonna clip that part out. I'm gonna make it like my ringtone or something.
I think it should be
Greg saying it. Erica, do you view it the same? How do you view the distinction between elders and deacons? You mentioned already that deacons aren't necessarily a teaching role. Would you agree with that? The way that Greg's articulating, or do you think that they are technically leaders? How would you define it or describe it?
If you agree with the way Joe said it, not me.
Yeah, I'll agree with Joe's statement.
Yeah, that's good. All right, we all agree with Joe. Thank goodness. Yeah,
I think you both.
That's really why I brought you all here today.
Amen.
Yeah, the spotlight is on you. No, I agree with what you guys said. Yeah, there's biblical conflicts when you understand deacons to be people of authority. Actually, I will just read you. This is from Thayer's Greek Lexicon. It says, a deacon is one who, by virtue of the office assigned him by the church, cares for the poor and has charge of and distributes the money collected for their use. That's how Thayer's there's some problems though with saying that a deacon is in a position of authority, because there are other texts like Romans 16:1, which seem to suggest that women can be deacons, but there are texts actually earlier in 1 Timothy chapter 2 verses 11 and 12, where Paul says that women are not to teach or exercise authority over men, therefore they can't be elders. So if a woman can be a deacon, but she can't be an elder, well, first of all, that means deacons and elders aren't the same thing, but it also means that a deacon is not someone who has the authority of an elder. So if you put the pieces together, because the Bible, it's like it gives us enough to work with where we can at least rule some things out right away. And I think that's one of the things that we can rule out, is that a deacon is not an elder. The qualifications are not the same, although they're similar. A woman can be a deacon. I don't believe a woman can be an elder. I think 1 Timothy 2, if Paul is saying that women cannot teach or exercise authority over men, and then he turns around and says that women can be elders, well, that's a contradiction, because elders were to teach and exercise authority over the church. So
now,
yeah,
in fairness to the other side of the argument, and again, I don't agree with this, but I think what somebody would say who holds that women can't be deacons is that when Phoebe is described as a deaconess, it's not, you shouldn't take that in the official office-bearing title, but she's just a servant-hearted, servant-minded, ministry-minded individual. So the people that would, and there are many of them, that would disagree with the position that women potentially could be deaconesses, would say that Phoebe there isn't being described in an official role.
And I think we all would agree, we see places where like Barnabas is called an apostle, but we wouldn't call him a capital A apostle. So that argument is at least understandable, and I do agree that not every the title itself as a servant. Many modern translations don't call her a deaconess, but just say a servant of this church, which is recognizing someone who is faithful, but maybe isn't serving in that capacity. However, as you've defined it, I don't see that would be in violation of anything that Paul wrote elsewhere, and certainly delivering the book of Romans is different than teaching through or preaching the book of Romans. But this was no unimportant task. If Phoebe was the one delivering this book, I mean, look, she served not just the church at Rome, but she served us by being faithful in bringing this letter from the Apostle Paul. Something that has been foundational for the church since it was inspired by God, and so that's a pretty significant thing. So I don't know. I appreciate you bringing that up. I do think that sometimes people are like, they go so far as like we're tearing down Phoebe. I know that's not your intent, but like what she was doing was pretty important, and so certainly. We have biblical example, whatever Phoebe was, she was a faithful sister in the Lord, and we should be very careful we're not tearing down what it was that the role that she was participating in. Eric, looks like you were turning somewhere. You got something to read for us, or?
Yeah, and I'm actually, I thought I had this note in front of me, but turns out I don't. So I'm pulling up a note that I have on deacons here. But I want to just point something out. It's an observation. And I just wanted to get your guys' thoughts on this, because, I think if you just look at 1 Timothy 3 later on, what Paul says, it sounds as if he's saying that even within the same chapter, that women can be deacons. And I'm pulling up my note here, but it's going to take me a minute to pull it up.
Well, I can talk to that while you're looking up your note if you'd like.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Beginning at verse 8 in chapter 3, Paul shifts his attention away from overseers, and he switches it to deacon. And he starts off saying, deacons likewise must be men of dignity, not double-tongued. He goes on to list some things, and then in verse 11, there's a transition where he says, women must likewise be dignified. And the argument there is, that doesn't, like, the argument would be the NASB should have translated that wives, meaning their wives, meaning these office bearers, these men who hold the office of deacon, there is a qualification put on their wives that they must likewise be dignified, not malicious gossips and temperate, which on its face, I think that's a good thing. If I was to be a deacon, my wife shouldn't, if we were to recognize someone as a deacon in the church, I wouldn't want that gentleman's wife to be a malicious gossip. That'd be a bad thing, especially with the roles put there. But unfortunately, the text doesn't say their wives. It just says, it either says wives or it says women. The word, I'm going to mispronounce it, so I won't say it. But yeah, it is equally valid to translate it women or wives. And so I choose to read it the way the NASB translates it. Women must likewise be dignified. Could that be saying the women who are married to these men? It might be saying that. That's not the way I read it. It seems to me that it's laying out some additional understanding particular to the women. So women must be just like what's above, but also bear in mind these particular things that may be particular traps to women.
It sounds like we all agree. The office of elder is restricted to males, and the office of deacon, or the role of deacon, is open to both men and women who meet the criteria. Certainly, this is a very controversial passage, and there are those who do think that this is describing the qualifications of deacons' wives. And anybody who's in that position, they bear an extra, at least a slightly additional burden of proof, is to say, well,
why weren't the elders' wives?
Why would deacons' wives have a criteria, but elders' wives do not? Why? Certainly, what you said, it would make sense. Yes, if I'm a deacon, it would be good that my wife is not a gossip, and a busybody.
Even more important if I was an elder.
But yeah, why would that be any less so? If I'm an elder, why does it go without saying? Of course, some people try and reconstruct the historical situation, say, well, there's just some issue that he's dealing with there, that maybe the deacons' wives were particularly problematic. But that's all just hearsay and conjecture. Like that's not a real answer, at least to me. I suppose if you're already in that camp that you want to open, But I think that what you're describing makes a lot more sense. And okay, here's the qualifications for the men who would serve as elders, and then here's qualifications for both the men and the women who would serve as deacons, and they're all given within that same context. That at least makes sense. They're not a teaching position, so that or an authoritative position, so it doesn't violate any of the other passages that would seemingly restrict those offices. But I remember I got a call one time from a guy who was church shopping, and he said on the phone, hey, I'm tired of going to liberal churches. Are you a liberal church? I go, I don't think so, but I guess I don't know.
I don't think so.
I guess I don't really know what that means. And so I was like, I'd be happy to talk with you about things. He's like, well, do you have women elders? I go, well, no, I think that the Bible is clear that the role of elders are restricted to males. And he's like, good, all right, that's good. And then we kind of kept going down the list, and we had a nice conversation. We were probably on the phone for 45 minutes. And then he said something about deacons. I said, well, I do think that women can be deacons. And I talked about Phoebe, and he goes, well, that'd be contradictory to these other things. I'm like, well, it's not contradictory. You're choosing to read it in a certain way, but then now, it just depends on how you read certain passages. What do you do with Phoebe, who's a deaconess or a female deacon of this place? What do you do with these passages? And then he called me a liberal and hung up on me after a nice conversation for, like I said, probably 45 minutes of pleasantries, and then 6 or 7 minutes of he got pretty mad pretty fast. But these passages do seem to be,
and again, I think it all goes back to our misunderstanding of what a deacon is. Because if we put deacons in their proper place, this, I don't think it'd be a problem at all.
Well, yeah, if the deacons are the ones making all the decisions, and if the deacons are the ones hiring and firing the pastor, and if the deacons are the ones, that's a very authoritative position. But if the deacons are doing like what Phoebe did of being a faithful, my goodness, how many how many women have you guys met that are wonderful sisters in the Lord, that are wonderfully faithful, that you know if they were entrusted a task, that they're going to get it done? And to think that they couldn't serve and be recognized as someone who's a faithful, just a wonderful part of the body that, okay, look, we're going to give this to you, and we know that you will execute this, you'll deliver this. Phoebe, I'm going to trust the book of Romans to you to be delivered, and it'll actually get there. Why would we want to try and restrict people from doing that? Especially if there is no reason that says that. Of course, women are supposed to participate in the body of Christ. And so I think that some who have really rightly recognized male headship, which all of us do, have gone overly restrictive, and to the point where what are ladies supposed to do in the church? To properly understand deacons, I do think that they are leadership. I would use that role. I think that the office of deacon is a leadership role, but it's not an authoritative position. It's not a teaching position. And so it seems to me, I don't think that this is some crazy liberal, I think it's just a biblical perspective, that it is certainly open to both qualified men and women.
Yeah. Okay. I hear you, and I agree 99%. What is leadership if not authoritative? If it doesn't have, if you are a leader that does not bear any authority, are you a leader? What does that mean?
Well, if someone is given a task and they are executing that task, I do think that there probably is some authority. I mean, Phoebe had to make certain decisions on. I don't know that they wrote out her entire thing and made all of her decisions for her and giving her you have to get from this place to this place and you have to deliver these things. There's decisions that have to be made. So, is she exercising authority over men in that case? I don't think so. But let's. I don't know. You raised the question whether the 7 are deacons or not. I think they are. I don't know what you would say for that. But if we grant that they are deacons, they've been now tasked with the authority pertaining to that scope to actually carry out the task, carry out the function. And so they are leading in the fact that they're the ones that are responsible. If these widows aren't getting fed, I'm coming and asking you a question. Why? What's going on? Give an accounting for what's happening. Now, are they taking the authority to do this on their own apart from the decision-making group? They're not, but they are the ones that are tasked with completing it. And I think that they at least have some, I would think if I did the same thing with one of my kids or something, I send my kid with a letter or something, or I put them in charge of the other children. It's not that they're authoritative over the other kids. They are operating in the authority that I have delegated to them, at least for that particular task. And I don't see any problem with that. But some people might, and I understand that. But I guess
it does go back to how broadly we define leadership. So I'm fine with your.
If we give them the definition of saying you got to keep the books, you sit here, you tally the money in, you tally the money out, you give an accounting. There is some leadership that it's not just I don't know how you would say, well, they're given a title, they're given a function, but they don't actually do anything. They have to to do something, and there's going to be some aspect of leadership in getting it done.
I suppose that's always true. When I think of keeping the books, I don't think you need to exercise a whole lot of leadership in accounting. But again, I'm not uncomfortable with how you're defining it.
I hear what you're saying, and I guess on the other side I would say, but if you don't actually take the lead, then it won't get done. You have to do it.
So
someone
has
to come in and
you're not leading.
Well,
people,
and that's where
it's a task.
Yeah, exercising responsibility. So in my mind, exercising responsibility, keeping the books, is not the same thing as leading. But again, I'm bringing in a whole lot of military and other spheres of information as I think about what is a leader, and I would differentiate a leader and a manager, right? So I'm probably bringing a lot of other context to the conversation.
Let's say it's the books, right? Someone has to come to me and say, Joe, I need receipts for these things that happened. Is that them leading me, or is that them they have a task and they have some realm of responsibility? If they don't do it, if they don't gather the needed information and actually tally the things and do it, then it won't get done. So yeah, it depends on how we view leadership. Certainly, if we're talking about directing people, that's that is not how I'm meaning it.
Okay,
But there
fair
might
enough.
be some relation to that someone, I feel like Phoebe in that, it's not inconceivable to me that she would have had to say, listen, I need access to, your leaders. And the leaders are like, no, she doesn't get access to us. We tell her when she does. Like, no, I need to give this to you. I got to bring it to you. So in some regard, but is that her exercising authority over the church in Rome? I don't think so. That's for anybody who would take a view like that. It's like, well, now a woman can't ever talk to anybody ever, lest her words influence them and make them, do something. Like I don't think the Bible is so
pass the salt.
restrictive.
No, you're exercising leadership, right?
No, I passed it now. That means she's my boss. Like,
Exactly,
I mean, those kinds of arguments to me are just silly. But task oriented over people, there is, I think, a differentiation there, and I view deacons as serving a particular task. Now, of course, those tasks affect people, and they are related to people, but they don't. It seems to me that the elders should be leading, exercising authority, making decisions, preaching and teaching. If the 7 were the first deacons, which again I believe that they are, but the important task of feeding the widows, say, we need to entrust this to faithful people who will get the task done so that we can do the task that only we can do, which is preaching and teaching and praying and leading the people. And so these people need to be cared for. So this task of caring for these people is important. But, the delineation of those, I think they could have exercised
and I guess
something
that
looked like authority in getting that done.
Yeah.
So,
and I would even go so far as to say that there are some functions that would be appropriate for male deacons and some that would, and therefore inappropriate for female deacons, depending on what those functions were.
I see no reason to push back against that. Eric, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that I think there are good reasons to believe that that the women mentioned in 1 Timothy 3:11 are women who are candidates for being deacons. Some translations do say they're wives, which would be the wives of deacons. But as you guys already said, if this is so, then we're left to wonder why no qualifications are mentioned for the wives of overseers. That's a big question mark there. And the word likewise suggests that these women were expected to meet the same qualifications as the men previously mentioned. So they also seem to be candidates for the office of deacon. And it's nearly impossible to overlook the similarities between the qualifications listed here and those included in verse 8. So I honestly think the most natural way to take this is to see it as the women mentioned in verse 11 are candidates for deacons. I don't think this is any stretch at all. I think it's perfectly consistent with the context. And to make it into deacons' wives, I think I think that, to me, that seems like a bit of a stretch. So I would just leave it at that.
So again, for the sake of just kind of summarizing the point, it sounds like we're all in agreement. I would articulate it this way. Elders and deacons are both offices in the church. They're titles that mean something. Elders are a teaching, authoritative, leading or ruling type position, and deacons are a non-teaching service position, but both have very significant moral qualifications that are to be met in order to be able to serve in these roles. Would you add something to that, take anything away from that, or would you say amen to that? How do you, Greg, kind of as we summarize the differences between these roles, agree, disagree, add, push back?
Completely, vehemently agree. Strenuously agree.
Strenuously agree. All right. Eric, strenuous agreement, lackadaisical agreement? I don't know. We got some weird descriptors.
Ultra agreement. How about that?
You outdid me. You bugger.
Ultra? No Uber agreement, though.
Uber
That's too
agreement.
bad. I was hoping for Uber agreement. All right. So let's move forward then. And again, of course, obviously others might disagree. So if you're watching this and you disagree, go ahead and let us know down in the comments below. We'll be happy to read those. But let's talk about some of the qualifications. So the main texts, we've already at least alluded to some of them. 1 Timothy chapter 3, Titus chapter 1. These main texts that kind of give these elder qualifications, they're not exactly the same, but they are very, very similar. There are slight differences, and certainly if you guys are interested, we could talk about that. Are there other relevant texts that we should add aside from the main list in 1 Timothy 3 and the main list in Titus chapter 1? Are there other qualifications texts that you guys would want to say if you're preparing a job description, or if you're just evaluating leadership or evaluating yourself, that you would include for elder qualifications?
I think I would definitely include 1 Peter 5. I think it continues to unpack it a little bit.
1 Peter 5. We read the first couple of verses, so I think that's fair. What about you, Eric? Would you add other main texts?
No, I think 1 Peter chapter 5 is a good text to include in the mix. So yeah, I think that would be one. I'm not sure. No other one really comes to mind right now, but I think those are probably the key texts dealing with this.
All right. So we won't probably, just for the sake of time, be able to get into every single nuance of these lists, but I want us to talk about some of the issues outside of 1 Timothy 3, outside of Titus 1, outside of 1 Peter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17 is a verse that I've at least heard brought up in these discussions. And so I don't know that this needs to become like a main text for a qualification, but it does potentially add a different delineation, I guess, of duties rather than what we've just described. And this would be not between elders and deacons, but within the office of elder itself as to two different types of elders. So 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17 says, "The elders who rule well are to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching." And so the idea of, okay, is there such a thing as a ruling elder and a teaching elder? And is that what this is talking about? That all elders, at least by some virtue, are ruling elders, but those who are also teaching elders, who work hard at preaching and teaching, that those are worthy of double honor. And I would say that those who don't work that hard at preaching and teaching but do it anyway, they're probably not worthy of double, maybe half honor. That's my my paraphrase. If you're going to be a preacher and a teacher, you should probably work hard at your preaching and teaching. I think that anyway, that's a tongue-in-cheek comment. I'm not trying to add to Scripture, but do you guys think that this is describing a delineation between maybe what some people would think of? Okay, here's a full-time pastor, someone who's paid to preach and teach, and then someone who is maybe a businessman in some other form or retired or whatever else. They're not a regular preacher and teacher in the body, but they are they rule. They go to the elder meetings, they make decisions, they exercise authority over the body. So ruling elder versus teaching elder, is that what's being described here, or is this saying something else?
Yeah, as I read this, I try to translate this out of like, as I wrestle with it. Okay, if I were to use a statement the same way, would it make sense? So when I see elders who rule well are to be considered worthy of double honor, I see that creating a classification that says, here are elders, and what they're doing that sets them apart is ruling well. And I go on, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. I see the preaching and teaching, those working hard at it, are a subset of the elders who are ruling well. Now, I'm sure there's a subset, or there's another set that elders who don't rule well, probably none of them are working hard at preaching and teaching.
They ought to be removed.
They ought to be, amen,
Yeah.
brother.
Yeah.
So I see those working hard at preaching and teaching as a subset of elders who are ruling well. That's how I read the text.
So you do see at least some distinction between like maybe the regular preacher and teacher and other elders who don't have they have the ruling part, but they don't necessarily have the preaching and teaching aspect, at least as a common regular part of their ministry.
I think, yeah, I can see what I don't want to do is say, you're an elder who's just in charge of ruling. You're an elder who's just in charge of teaching. And now you've, in effect, created separate categories. I think that there are some people who are elders, who are responsible for ruling, who are responsible for oversight, who mark themselves out as those who are particularly interested in or particularly gifted in preaching and teaching.
Eric, how do you view it?
I'll be honest with you. I've never really given this that much consideration. I did want to point out that, well, let me just say this first, I guess. I'll just start by saying this. I agree that there may be elders who, are exercising oversight in some capacity, but they're not, not as involved in teaching as others. But the word rule here might kind of throw some people off because
it does for sure.
Because rule kind of sounds like, like you're ruling with an iron fist or something. But the Greek word that's translated rule, it means to be a protector or guardian, to give aid, to care for, to give attention to. I think that's how, I want to say that might be how Strong's defines the word. But so when we think of rule, it's not like I'm ruling the way that a king would rule. It's not that kind of rule. It's more of the way that a shepherd would, watch over a flock. It's an elder is, among other things, a shepherd and overseer. So I think that's the idea there. But it does, as you guys were talking, it does kind of sound like, there might be, there might be a distinction between like, an elder who maybe doesn't do as much teaching, but does other things, and an elder that is primarily involved in teaching. But to be honest with you, I haven't really considered that. I guess with relation to this verse. So I'm not sure that I have a whole lot to add to it.
The text says that an elder must be able to teach, but it doesn't say that every elder must be equally engaged with teaching and preaching as the next. So, if you had two or three guys who were actively, participating in the teaching and preaching ministry, and then there was, two guys who, hey, we're going to focus on other things, and you need us to step in. We can step in and teach a Sunday school or preach on occasion, but that's not our focus. I don't see any reason to reject that as a practice, as long as they are able, as the qualifications state.
Almost every church body I've ever seen or been a part of has at least some distinction of kind of the more regular teachers. I had when I first kind of got into ministry, I split the time. I preached 50% of the time. So I had half the Sundays, and another guy had half the Sundays. But there were other members of the elder board. So it's not like it was split up by every elder. It was just there were two of us that split time, which I thought was neat. I liked having like kind of a team approach to that. But I'm sure there probably are existing somewhere local churches that, if you've got 3 or 4 guys on the elder board, they just rotate. I think I've heard of that. I've never been a part of a body that acted in that particular way. But almost everybody's got, even if you have a plurality of elders, there is one or a few of the members of that elder board who are the regular, you just expect to see them preaching and teaching at almost everything, or at least much more commonly. And I think a verse like this is often the explanation of that you have a number. You're expected. We agreed, not everybody agrees, but we agree anyway that a local church should have a plurality of elders. And one of those qualifications is they are able to teach, but does that mean that they must teach, and they must teach a certain amount of time? I don't think that you can go so far with the scriptures. And so if someone is able to teach, but someone has maybe more of a gifting to teach or more of a passion to teach, that they work hard at that they should be free to pursue that. Maybe some of the elders take some other aspects off. Maybe they're more administratively focused, or they are their oversight is in a different a different scope. And I think that seems perfectly reasonable. I don't know that I would go so far as to saying that then, we're carving out some very clear lines based on this, but I do think that this is a passage that, at least for me, allows the idea that if someone is an elder, that they don't have to preach every Sunday. They don't have to teach it every midweek thing. They don't have to have necessarily like a regular teaching aspect. They should be capable of stepping into any of those things if needed, but that it's not required that they preach or teach a certain amount in order to maintain their status as an elder. To me, that's kind of how I view a passage like this. So you guys, again, we don't have to belabor the point. So if anybody's got anything else on this, we can, I'll give you the last word on it. Otherwise, we can look at some of the other interpretive issues as it relates to elders. Because I think some people do think, well, if you're going to be an elder, you have to preach a certain amount. I don't view that way, but some people think, like, I've had people say to me, like, as I've had other people preach, to go, I thought you're the preacher. I'm like, well, yeah, I am. But we can have other people preach and teach every once in a while. They're like, well, are they paid? Like, maybe.
No,
I mean, maybe. Like, what's the difference? But I don't know. Like, I'm not earning my money if I don't stand up and give my talk every Sunday or whatever. Which I get it. But I don't know if you guys have ever heard that or not. But anyway, you guys got anything else to add on 1 Timothy 5:17?
No, I'm good.
No.
All right. So what about some of these other qualifications? One of the most potentially controversial is the husband of one wife. Now, the reason I say that this is potentially controversial is not because people who have an interpretation of it, think that they're correct. It's that there are so many different ways of interpreting this particular phrase. And so the husband of one wife is something that is repeated. It's not like it's just only found in one place. We see that it is given for both deacons and for elders, and so this is something that would make it really applies to both. As we've already talked about with the translational issues, this could be, if we're very literally translating this, it could be a one-woman man. Now, one-woman man, I don't know what that means to you guys, but to me, that is more of a moral qualification rather than a box that is to be checked. I believe that you could be an unmarried person who is, at least by character, a one-woman man. I think that you could be someone who is married to one wife but is not a one-woman man. You can have eyes that are full of adultery and a heart that is lusting after everybody. And so, at least in your character, it's not a checkbox. To be described as a one-woman man, at least to me, means something very different than just a qualification on a piece of paper. However, some who would view this it's a very clear box. You must be married to one woman. That would mean that anybody who's ever been remarried, potentially, maybe your wife died and you took a second wife, they would say you're disqualified. Others might say that if you've ever been divorced, that this doesn't mean the husband of one wife. They interpret it as never having been divorced, which is, of course, not what it says, but that is how many people interpret it. And there are many people in the church that say divorce disqualifies you from being an elder, and this would be the text. I'm looking at 1 Timothy 3:2, but again, it's repeated. There are some who would say that this means that you must be married, so all single people are out. If you're not married, you couldn't possibly meet this criteria. How do you guys view it? So again, I just threw out a bunch of different views, and it might not even seem to some people like that matters, but it does. When you're starting to evaluate people, can we evaluate single men who have never been married? Can we evaluate someone who has been remarried but because a spouse has died? Does divorce disqualify somebody, even if that divorce was way in the past? They were married and divorced as an unbeliever. They get saved later in life. They've been married faithfully, but they were divorced a long, long time ago. Are they disqualified? How do you view this? What do you think this particular text is saying? Greg, we'll hand it over to you first.
Yeah, this text is, for me, backstory, right? I have been divorced. I was married. My wife at the time, very much against my will, left. very quickly after, she remarried. And so this is something that's very personal to me, something that to this day kind of affects the scope of my ministry, at least in some people's mind. And so this, first of all, this is a real issue for me, and it probably will seem self-serving to some. I take the one woman man, the way you described, Joe, as a moral characteristic instead of the husband of one wife, because, first of all, again, taking a more literal, just grammatical reading of it, but I also take it because when you say the husband of one wife, it does open the door to, widowers are allowed to remarry, people who were divorced before they even came to faith, all of those questions. And now what some people, I don't like, it becomes very difficult. What do you do with all of those situations if it is husband of one wife? And really quickly, what you'll hear is people go, well, it obviously doesn't mean someone whose wife died. Well, why is that obvious? Well, it's obvious because it's obvious to you, and you like the simple explanation. I believe, as this is describing character traits, as we look at the rest, must be above reproach, one woman man, temperate, prudent, respectable, hospitable. This isn't looking for is the checkbox of married, never divorced there. It's a moral characteristic of, is this person a person who's faithful and honoring in regards to sexual purity. So I read it that way because it's a literal a literal translation. I read it that way because it fits within what's happening within the text, and because it doesn't open up the door that we have to arbitrarily close because we don't like having to say that widowers can't be elders.
This is one of those areas where I think it is, and everything you said is perfectly reasonable. However, I know that if you say that to at least some people who aren't here on this panel, they think it's completely unreasonable. This is one of those areas where we kind of talked about it a little bit in our last episode, and we've talked about it many times, over our conversations. But what does the text actually say? And, as soon as we move beyond what it actually says to what we think it means, now we're in our interpretation. And of course, we shouldn't be surprised that some people don't interpret it, and it doesn't, quote unquote, obviously mean the same thing to everybody. And so, some people would be, well, no, if God took your wife, and if you were a faithful man worthy of being an elder, you wouldn't get remarried. Like, well, that's going pretty far beyond the text. That's a fair opinion. You can have that opinion, but it doesn't say that. I appreciate you sharing some of your personal backstory. I've sat in meetings and I've heard other people that are, from their own testimony that have been devastated, saying, well, I guess I'm disqualified, because people say the Bible says, you must never have been divorced. I'm like, well, where does it say that? Because Paul very easily could have said that. He could have said, he must never have been divorced. That's a different statement. That's not what this says. And so what does he mean? Does he mean that? Well, it is possible that that's what he means. And I'm not going to close the door on that possibility, but just being careful to say, what does the text actually say? Well, it says a one-woman man, or maybe it does say a husband of one wife. But a one-woman man is a perfectly reasonable, literal translation of what the words actually say, which is a different statement than someone who has never been divorced, or someone who has never been widowed and remarried, or someone who's never been remarried, right? These are all words that don't actually appear here. So I think that what you said is reasonable, and this is controversial for those very reasons, that what seems reasonable to us often doesn't seem reasonable to somebody else who we've immediately stepped off of what it actually says to what we think the implications of what it quote unquote obviously means. And I love that you use that, because that's one of those, well, it's obvious, it's clear.
Yeah, it's clear. It doesn't say obviously it doesn't mean that. Well, why?
Yeah. So Eric, do you view it similarly? Do you have some other obvious conclusion to make that is different than the obvious ones we're saying here?
Oh, mine is as obvious as it gets.
I can't wait. Yeah. Clear it up for us, brother. Yeah.
No, actually, I'm in line with what Greg said. He says the husband of one wife. Now there's a nearly identical statement that's made in 1 Timothy 5, verse 9, and this verse is applied to widows who aren't even married anymore. Their husbands died, and he says a widow is to be put on the list. I think the list of widows that the church supports, I think is what that means. Only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man. Now, when he says a husband of one wife, the first thing we can I think reasonably conclude is you don't necessarily have to be married, because this widow had to meet these qualifications, and she was the wife of one husband who had already died. So you could perhaps make the argument that it's really the idea is that she was faithful to her spouse while he was alive. Okay, and so she still is at heart someone who is a one. In her case, a one man woman. If I got that right.
Because elsewhere in the Bible, we are given clear teaching that a woman is allowed to marry a new husband. She's free from that if her husband's dead. So are we going to say that this woman is suddenly unfit to be cared for because both husbands have died?
Well, actually, Paul encourages younger widows to get remarried.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't seem reasonable that he would be urging them to disqualify themselves should tragedy strike them again from being cared for by the body of believers. That would just be an odd. Yeah. But he urges the younger widows, if they can, to not be a burden on the church, to get remarried so that they won't be added to the list. So that's verse 14, same chapter. I want younger widows to get married.
But if they do, guess what? We're never going to help you again.
What I want you to do is disqualify yourself from being cared for. Like that doesn't seem. It just doesn't seem like to be the line of thought.
It's a good budgetary process, though. Like as a budgetary principle. Hey, listen, if they get remarried, we won't ever have to support them again.
Yeah. Well, so I think a one man woman or a one woman man. I don't think it's describing necessarily a person's current status, current marital status. I think it's just simply saying that whoever the person was married to or is married to, that they were or are faithful to that person. They have a faithful heart. They're going to be committed to that person. And I'll give you my opinion. Paul doesn't speak on this directly, but I think there are Christians, I know some, who they were faithful to their wives, and I'll just give you a very specific example. So, a relative of mine was married, became a Christian, and his wife did not. And he, followed Christ, and she didn't. And eventually, she just decided, well, that's not for me. I'm not going to do that. So she left him and divorced him. And but it wasn't any moral fault of his. He was just faithful to Christ, and she didn't want anything to do with that. And I think my opinion on this, and it's only an opinion, but my opinion on this is, I think in situations like that, I don't think that would disqualify a man from becoming an elder. Now, I know there's some will say, well, yes, because if he just was more spiritual, if he just did a little bit better, then she would have stayed. She would have
been saved. If he was better, she would have been saved.
Or they might say that even if that's the case, that she left, that he should just remain single, and that's you still would meet the criteria because you still are married to that one person, even if they've left you or whatever. But anyway, like that's an argument that I've heard. Well, if you were more serious, you wouldn't take on another spouse. Now you would dedicate yourself to the church, and if you're not, if you want to go get another wife, fine. you've made a decision to remove yourself from consideration for leadership in the church. I'm not saying I agree with that, but that's
definitely out there.
What do you guys think about this passage? I know there's obviously a lot of debate when it comes to this subject, but I think the main verse that people would use to say that if you were a believer who's married to an unbeliever and your unbelieving spouse abandons you, you can get remarried. And it would be like in 1 Corinthians 7:15, where it says, "Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace." Now, how this has been translated, or interpreted in recent times is when he says that they're not under bondage, it means that they're not under the marriage bond anymore. That bond has been broken because the unbeliever left. They abandoned the believer. The marriage bond now it no longer remains intact, so the believer is not under obligation to remain single because the bondage is no longer there.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that, and I guess I wouldn't have a whole lot of pushback against it. I don't think. I know for me, again, I've been through it. It didn't feel. My conscience was not at ease with going and finding someone else until the time that my ex-wife married someone else, and I went, well, okay, there's no chance there's no way in my mind, as I understand the text, that I could be reunited with her now that she's united herself with somebody else. But that's my personal conviction.
Yeah. So there are two issues that are on the table right now, and they don't necessarily fight with one another. They certainly can interact with one another. But the question is someone free to, Greg, in your circumstance, right? Okay, you had in your heart a desire to possibly reconcile. Now it seems that opportunity has passed. Certainly if someone whose former spouse dies, again, there's no opportunity to reconcile at that point. If someone else is remarried, doesn't seem like there's much opportunity to reconcile at that point. In fact, what are you going to do? Try and, destroy that bond so that you can be that becomes very, very untenable. So you feel personally that, okay, I'm free to remarry. Seems like 1 Corinthians 7 for the situation you were describing, Eric, that someone becomes a believer, the unbelieving spouse leaves. They didn't want them to leave, but they're sick of this Christian doing Christian things, so off they go and they leave them. They're free to be remarried to a believing spouse. These are not sins, right, that would put somebody out of the church. You're like, okay, we got to bring this person up on church discipline because they're practicing some sin. However, does that mean that they're qualified to be leaders? That's the question that we're answering. And so I think that we could very reasonably say, yeah, that you're well within your Christian rights to take on a believing spouse, or these aren't the types of things that disqualify you from entry into into heaven, or that put you up for church discipline. But do they take you off the list of consideration for leadership? I guess is if I'm playing the kind of that pushing back or whatever else. And I think that you could believe both. I think you could believe, yes, you are free to do that, but someone might reasonably say, and I'm not saying I agree with it, but they might reasonably say, Greg, what you did was perfectly fine. You didn't violate your conscience. You didn't sin. However, you can't ever be an elder here because you don't check this box. What would you, I guess, where do you go from there? Is that,
That's a great question.
Yeah.
where I go from there is, okay, I accept your decision. As elder, I mean, it's not hard to put myself in that context. I have placed myself under the authority of a local church. If that local church comes to that decision, I live with that. Okay, fair enough. Now, if at the end of the day they're wrong, well, God will settle that. God will change their minds. God will strike them all dead and put me in charge of everything. Or
I'm gonna hold my breath for that.
Yeah, don't. Or or I'm going to, or God will use this as a way to teach me humility and patience. And it's just one of the ways, just one of the other ways that I learn to endure and learn to be wronged for no good reason. If there is no good reason, right? If I'm incorrect and they are correct, it's something as a mature believer. If I'm right that all of these qualifications are about being a mature believer, I believe a mature believer would hear that and go, okay, all right. I disagree, but I disagree peacefully.
Yep, I think that's fair. Eric, would you have anything to add to that?
I think that was a really good answer. And yeah, I think sometimes we just, have to, I think in these situations, sometimes just being submissive is the best way to go. I think sometimes people just want to argue their case so strongly, and they want to fight and cause conflict and strife in the church. And it's like, I think a lot of the time just submission is just the best route to take, and God will honor that submission.
Let me tell you a secret also, right? It's if someone desires to be an overseer, they desire a good thing, but they also desire a very hard thing. It's emotionally hard. It's spiritually hard. Sometimes I'm more convinced that it's just fine not being an elder, not being in church leadership. It's much easier. I promise you that, not being responsible for the oversight and the spiritual health of other individuals besides just me and my family. It's a good thing. So if you want it so bad that you're willing to make other people miserable to get it, you're probably wanting it for the wrong reasons.
Well, I think that's very well said. And, the idea, one of the other qualifications is being above reproach. And that to me is kind of a catch-all that, I would have to, for my own life, right? I'm not talking about you guys. I'm just talking about me now. Like if there was something in my life that would cause either so much uproar about me personally, either directly to me or to my other, people that I'm in leadership with, I would think, well, I guess probably if I have to err on the side of caution, even if I am actually technically qualified, if it's going to cause all this controversy, that now all of a sudden everybody's so focused on me and my circumstances or my situation, probably that idea of, I guess maybe I'm just not above reproach. And so now I'm not qualified for that reason. Even if I'm right about this, this one area, if it's constantly a problem. And so there are some bodies that, quite frankly, there's going to be people who just, they can't handle someone who's been divorced in the past for whatever reason. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are, they can't handle it. And in those bodies, it would be unwise, I would think, to try and change their minds necessarily. Obviously, God can bring change of mind if they're incorrect. We should want them to repent, but I don't know that it's worthwhile to try and win the argument, right? We're going to bring this guy in and we're going to do it this way. We're going to lay hands on this person. We're just going to constantly be fighting about this, cause a church split. What's the point? However, there are other local bodies that they have a different interpretation. They agree with us. It's more of a moral qualification rather than a checkbox. And so I'd rather have someone who is faithful. That's the position I'm in. I don't think it means never divorced. I don't think it means not remarried if their previous spouse, passed away. I believe that it's a one-woman man. And, one thing I didn't bring up is some thought this was possibly against polygamists, right? This was maybe disqualifying polygamists rather than, people who are in monogamous relationships. But if you want to be real literal and say, well, it means that anybody who's not married doesn't meet this qualification. Now we've disqualified as serving as an elder Jesus. We've disqualified Paul himself, who was telling them. And go, man, is that really the qualification we want to have? Those guys aren't fit to lead in the church. Jesus isn't qualified to be an elder. Come on.
I think there comes a point in interpretation where
we're absurd.
How far do you take it? Do you take it to the point where, you're disqualified? Is Jesus disqualified then? And Paul, as far as we know, Paul may have been married in the past. We don't know what happened to his wife, if she died or left. I mean, we just don't have that information. But yeah, I mean, do you take it so far where it just becomes absurd that?
But again, that's where somebody goes, well, obviously not. Well, why? Why do we obviously not ask those questions? But we obviously know this. It means this, and it obviously doesn't mean that. Well, why?
Yep. So, I think that in the reading of this, the understanding of it in its context, I don't think that Paul was just putting one kind of checkbox that was just like, this is more of a demographical information over anything else, and then the rest of them are kind of more moral qualifications. There is an argument, of course, that could be made, and that's another one that's on here, kind of that family situation, keeping children under control with all dignity. Does this mean that they must have children, plural? And some would say, if you've been remarried, even if your spouse died, same thing, that if God somehow sees fit to keep the womb closed of your wife, that you somehow don't meet this criteria. And there is, of course, an argument that could be made. And as someone who's served in church leadership for, a decade and a half plus, I do see the parallels between running a church and running a family, and serving and leading in those capacities. There are the argument that's made, if he can't operate his own household well, why would you put him in charge of the household of God? Of course, that makes sense. But does that mean that someone must have children? Or is it just saying that those who do have children have to exhibit this quality? Of course, those who don't have children, they have to exemplify their faithfulness in other ways. And again, I don't tend to view these as a list of like these legalistic check boxes. I think you guys have already said it. I'll just reiterate it. It's really, are these faithful, trustworthy, responsible people that take the faith seriously, that whatever a role that they have, if they are husbands, do they love their wife? I mean, are they constantly looking around for greener pastures, or are they faithful to this spouse? Bring that now into the church, right? You guys, I'm sure, have seen pastors who are viewing their jobs as stepping stones. They don't really care about this place. They want to hit some milestone to beef up their resume so they can go off to somewhere else. I mean, my goodness, is this the kind of person that you want? Someone who's always looking for a better wife and a better neighborhood and a better job? Probably not. You probably want someone who's faithful, who's going to stick with you through the good times and the bad times, the thick and the thin, for better or worse, so to speak. Same thing with the children. Do it if you've got a bunch of kids that don't respect their dad and are running around like maniacs, and like, why would we think that this person's going to be good at leading in the church? But if they don't have children, does that mean that they couldn't possibly fill this role, or is that what Paul's trying to say? I don't take it that way, but do you guys take it that way? Do you think that they must have children, that somehow if God has, had a guy who's married, maybe he's been faithfully married, but for whatever reason, him and his wife have never been able to have children, is that some sort of judgment from God that because I've heard that God has made it clear this person is not fit to be an elder because God won't allow them the blessing of childbirth. I'm not in that camp, but what do you guys think?
Obviously, if God hasn't given them children. Obviously. How do you say it like a liberal? Obviously.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
We're spiraling quickly now.
Yeah. No, it seems obvious to me, exactly as you said. This does not appear to me to be a checkbox. Does he have at least 2 children? Because it's keeping children, plural children, under control with all dignity. This is describing the character fiber of what a mature Christian looks like. Again, I think one disservice we do to ourselves is we treat these elder qualifications as achieving ubermensch, uber believer level of attainment. I think this is talking about what does a godly, mature, well-developed, well-rounded man look like. This person, that guy, he meets the necessary requirements to be considered for an elder. So, and God bless you if you want to make whether or not God has in His divine providence given a couple or given a man children. If you want to make that a qualification, God help you. What a horrible thing to do to somebody.
Yeah. I think in a similar vein, I have a friend of mine who's interpreted these, and I've heard him teach on this before. He's like, sometimes we elevate these qualifications, be like, yeah, this is the epitome of Christian maturity. And he's like, what if this is actually just kind of like the bare minimum? Like, we should be looking at a body, be like, come on, guys, let's get up to at least this And now this is the pool of people that we're looking at, but we should kind of expect that really everybody's kind of moving.
That's the goal.
In this direction.
Here's the bar. Get over the bar, and then the sky's the limit after that.
Yeah. Well, Eric, how about you? How do you think this is another checkbox? You must have at least 2 children, or do you view it a little bit more less demographic and more like we're kind of just dealing with the circumstances of the body and saying, like, if you have kids, you ought to be faithful in raising them. If the Lord hasn't blessed you with children currently for whatever reason, then this maybe doesn't apply to you, but this wouldn't disqualify you if you don't have kids. What do you think?
Yeah, if I remember right, John the Baptist's parents didn't have children for a very long time, and they were blameless according to the law all along. So not having children doesn't mean you have divine disfavor. I have always leaned toward the idea that Paul is saying, if a man does have children, they should be this way. And that's the way I've always saw it. And Paul didn't have children, but he was in an even higher office than an elder. He had the highest office that you can have as an ordinary man in the church, obviously under Christ, but above everybody else as far as his authority. So I guess I try and be as reasonable as I can be when interpreting these things, and I think the more we nitpick at stuff, the more we try and make things super specific, and I think that's just asking for problems. Because if you want to like read Paul's thoughts and say, okay, Paul meant you have to have 2 children. And Paul had in mind, if you don't have any children, you're cursed of God, and you're not fit to be an elder. If your interpretations are based on that kind of mind reading, when the text just simply doesn't say those things, I think you're going well beyond what's appropriate when you're trying to interpret a text.
Let me add one thing to this. And because I'm going to add it because of where we are as a culture, I believe that God gives babies, but people who are childless could very well be childless because God has chosen to withhold from them that blessing. Or you could be childless in our day and age because, quite frankly, you hate children. Like you could have this attitude like, man, what a hassle, what a pain, basically sneering at that blessing of God. Now, if I were to be an elder at my church and we were examining a man who didn't have kids, and he came and went, we'd love kids. We've considered adopting, but God just never has opened that door. And then, or if he answered, we don't have kids because, man, what a hassle, what a pain, I don't have great grounds to stand on, but I would definitely be much more leery about considering that man, the man who doesn't even want the blessing, as opposed to someone who says, so those 2 possibilities exist, and I think we ought to handle those 2 situations differently.
Yeah, I'm in agreement, and I think that it fits very well with what Eric is saying. I don't think that these qualifications are given to be overly nitpicky with that kind of checkbox mentality. But for me personally, if I'm evaluating someone, and I think that if as people are evaluating me, that this is the same kind of attitude that I would expect, that they don't just ask me like, well, are you married? Yes. Okay. Check the box. Why don't you see how I interact with my wife? Like, am I faithful to my wife? Do I love my wife? Or do I have a wandering eye? Like, that's much more important to me, I would think. And it should be more important to us. And same thing with children. Yeah, I hate kids. What an annoyance. What a bother. Oh well, how are you gonna deal with the bothersome nature of of ministry. Like, I mean, there's an awful lot of stuff that's bothersome in ministry.
Is there?
You got to deal with other people's kids. Like, I mean, that's going to be part of it, you know.
Which is harder than your own kids.
In many ways, for sure. Although I do have a lot more patience for other people's kids.
Because you can spank your own kids.
Amen, brother. YouTube's going to know that now.
Yeah. So the idea, you know, that you kind of would look at someone and say, like, all right, what is your heart? What is your intention? That to me just is so much more meaningful than the kind of the I keep saying that word, but that demographic checkbox thing. Like, I'm not looking for someone who just checks the boxes on paper. What does the direction of your life look like? And you know, certainly there are certain areas where if you know, my family's been blessed with a lot of children, so people have a lot of opportunity to evaluate me and say, okay, well, do my kids, do they listen to me? Like, am I able to you know, be a leader in my home with dignity? Do I have to threaten my kids, or do they respect me as a father enough so that they're willing to listen to me? Because if they won't, if I have to just threaten them constantly, and otherwise they're running around like wild people, maniacs. Am I going to have to do the same thing in the church? Am I going to have to like rule with a heavy hand? I have to threaten people, like, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to put you out, or put you up on church discipline. Like, that's not the kind of leader that we would want. That's not the kind of leader that we would expect. But then again, to go to the other side and say, well, someone who doesn't have kids, they're automatically disqualified. Well, there probably are other things in their life that we can say, well, have they been faithful in these other things? You know, did they serve well as a deacon? Were they, when we put them in task of in charge of making sure the widows got fed, did the widows get fed, or were they, you know, what happened? You know, like, let's look at the faithfulness of this person. And so if you have children, they ought to be respectful of their parents. That makes sense. If you don't have children, I don't think that this is intended to say, and they must have kids. If they don't have kids, they're disqualified. I think that's, to me, an absurd way of dealing with these qualifications.
You know, you say that, and it, as you say, you know, look at the pattern of their life. It just opens the door to so much critique against our modern way of hiring a pastor, you know, creating a search committee, and, you know, they send you in some of their YouTube clips and you watch it, and they come and visit for a week, and we go, yeah, let's give this guy the job.
Well, it's wow. Bizarre how we do it now. It is
bizarre, to say the least.
These would have been people that you have an opportunity to recognize their character because they're part of the body. You bring someone from the outside. Yeah, it's real easy to look good on, you know, I come in for a week, get my, you know, threaten my kids, make my wife pretend that she likes me. Everybody put a smile on. Hey, he's the best. You have no idea what you're actually getting in those categories. Whereas, you know, these qualifications, like, of the people that you're there, you know, these people, what do their lives look like? And I think that that's a huge thing to pay attention to. And, you know, related to this, Titus 1:6 talks about the children must be believers. This is an additional caveat. Obviously, you know, if you don't have children, they couldn't be believers. But if you have children, they must be believers. How do you guys deal with this one? There have been many examples. I think, you know, I'm not picking on him, but I think John Piper fairly recently, you know, he had a unbelieving child that was very publicly criticizing Christianity. And so there was, you know, a modern example of kind of wrestling through this issue. Does this apply only to children that are in your household? Does this apply to adult children? You know, having children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion. How do you guys deal with Titus 1:6?
Yeah, I read that as who are faithful, not who are born again believers. Now, I think we should look at the fruit, but like John Piper's a great example. Would we choose to erase his ministry because one of his children went wayward beyond all of his effort? I don't know John Piper personally, but I can, and I don't agree with him on everything by any stretch. But you look at the pattern laid down in his life, and would we seriously say this is a man completely unfit for ministry because later in life one of his children walked away from the faith? I find that to be a horrible absurdity. So are his children faithful? Are they adherent? Are they walking in the way that he would want them to when they are children, right? Because like, how responsible is John Piper, for instance, for the actions of his 30-year-old son? Is he still a child? You know, I know he's still a child of John Piper, but is he who is a 30-year-old man the person that this text has in mind? Again, I think this goes back to that, to a younger child in view, not an adult who is a man in and of their own right, or a woman for that matter.
Eric, what do you think?
I'll go so far as to say I think it's obviously younger children, because the text says keeping his children under control. That suggests that Paul is referring to young children who are still living at home under the elder's care. So it seems to me like if you just take the language in its most straightforward way, it sounds like he would have to be talking about young children living at home. And actually, we know it is, because he's talking about managing your household. Now, some would argue, well, maybe his adult children are still living at home, or he built onto his house to, so they could live there. But even if that were the case, if he did have adult children, I mean, I'm not responsible for spanking my 30-year-old child every time he misbehaves. And
it's not a bad idea, though.
Okay, well maybe I should, but and
then you can also open the door to, like, okay, what if they're 4 and don't believe? What if they're 5 and haven't professed Jesus as Lord and placed their faith and trust in him? Like, so is the idea an expression of faith in Christ, or is there this broader faithful idea at play?
Yeah. Well,
if you have 2-year-olds who obviously don't believe, are you unfit to be an elder?
What was the age you used?
I said 2.
Well, a 2-year-old. Yeah, a 2-year-old can't
that's my point.
Or disbelieve anything. That's
exactly my point.
That's why you baptize them.
That's why you dunk them. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, another good reason to baptize them. They don't have a clue what's going on. No, I think honestly, to me, the idea that Paul is talking about an adult child just seems like a betrayal of common sense. So I would just, that's obviously not the case.
All right. Well, let's leave it there for now. I had mentioned one other qualification that, again, I think is helpful. It certainly can be used just like these other ones, right? We can weaponize these qualifications. I don't want to weaponize them. I do want to take them seriously. The idea of being above reproach, and so that is a qualification that to me is very helpful in saying, okay, if we don't know exactly how this is supposed to be, what is the line? Like, again, someone's not supposed to be quarrelsome, but does that mean that they're just so agreeable that they never disagree with anybody, never push back on anything? Well, I don't think so. In fact, they must be able to refute those who contradict. So when do you cross that line? They must be hospitable. Well, what does that mean? How hospitable do they have to be? Do they have to have people over at their house every single, strangers at their house every single day? When do you cross the line into being inhospitable? These are not easy questions to answer. I don't ask them to be silly, but the idea of being above reproach, to me, starts to bring in, okay, would a reasonable Christian person, let's say, Eric, I'll just pick on you for a second. Someone wants to accuse you of being inhospitable because, they said, can I come over? And you're like, no, I'm busy. And they're like, see, he's inhospitable. Would I then view you as saying, is Eric... Does that accusation stick against you, or would people that know you go, well, no, come on, he's not being inhospitable? That's kind of how I view being above reproach. It's not can that might be the case. It's not just can nobody ever accuse you of anything. People can be accused of anything anytime, but will that does that accusation really stick? Like if somebody says this about you, would people believe it? Or does your character, to those who know you best, realize like, okay, no, he might have disagreed with you, but he's not trying to be mean to you, or he's not trying to like just, lord his authority over you, but he's trying to love the body, and he's doing his task of contradicting those who, refuting those who contradict sound teaching. Some would think, well, every single person in every single place in every single context has to think well of you. Well, I mean, Jesus said, woe to you if all men speak well of you. So I don't think he could possibly mean that. But that to me is a pretty important qualification. Are there other ones on here? I mean, again, not addicted to much wine. People argue about that. Like, does that mean that they never drink anything? What is much wine?
Can you be addicted to a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit of wine. So there are, obviously we could talk about these things, but we've almost talked for 2 hours at this point. So were there other qualifications or things on here that you guys wanted to make sure we kind of defined or discussed before we said goodbye for another episode?
I just want to say something about being above reproach. This is a tough one because it's like, again, with all of these, how far do you take it? I just want to just add a couple thoughts here. And actually, the first one is from Help's Word Studies. And Help's Word Studies defines above reproach this way: properly not apprehended or found wrong when censured or attacked, that is, without blame in light of the whole picture. Here, the person or the accuser trying to seize someone's character by unjustified censure is shown to be groundless, that is, when the matter is understood in its full context. I thought that was helpful because it's not just talking about, if anyone blames you for anything, you're no longer above reproach. It can't mean that. That's obviously not true. People accuse Christ of things, and Paul and others. So I think it seems like the idea there is that, like, let's say someone accuses you of doing something wrong. Actually, there was something that happened. I'm not going to go into detail what it was, but there's something that happened to me, and I asked myself, boy, am I still above reproach, even though this thing happened? And I had asked someone in our denomination, what do you think about this, and what are your thoughts on this? And he said something that I thought was helpful that kind of coincided with what Help's Word Studies said. He said, based on the context of the situation, like, I'm not sure exactly how I put it, but if circumstances were different, this would not have happened. But the fact that the circumstances were worked out the way they did, it's understandable why the situation happened. And he put it like this. He said, your yard can look good when the sun is shining, but even if you have a nice looking yard, it can look rough when there's a storm that is passing through. So I thought that was helpful, because it's like, I mean, does above reproach mean you've never made a mistake? Like you've never done anything that is wrong at all, and no one can ever accuse you of anything? I look at some other texts, like just a few examples. Actually, I got one on here. Peter. Just take Peter for example. Peter was an elder, and he called himself an elder in 1 Peter 5:1, and that was, I want to say, toward the end of his ministry, toward the end of his life, if I recall right. And that was after his sin of that's mentioned in Galatians chapter 2. And Peter used to eat with the Gentiles, and he wasn't worried about keeping the ceremonial law. But then when the followers of James came along, he would withdraw from the Gentiles and act like he was, superior to them, and it was confusing them because they thought, well, should we eat kosher food, or should we not worry about it? And so he basically set them up to stumble, and so Paul publicly rebuked him for that. And it was, if you read if you read the text, it seems like it was a fairly serious sin because he could have been leading people astray. After that happened, he still called himself an elder in 1 Peter 5:1. So in other words, that event didn't seem to disqualify him from the office of elder. So I don't think above reproach can mean you can't have any sin that you've ever committed, or you cannot have done anything wrong. It's kind of hard to draw the line, though, isn't it? Like,
I think about it this way, right? Like, this is like so many other things. I don't think being above reproach it can't be never having done anything wrong. And I don't even think it can be, we'll never do anything wrong again. I think this looks a lot like the Peter situation, where Peter was in error. He was wrong. Paul corrected him. And by all appearances, as far as we know, Peter went, "Oh, wow, yeah, that was dumb. Thanks."
It would have been hard. No, he could have said, "Who do you think you are?"
Yeah, who you are? I'm Peter. Don't you know I'm the first among equals and all that, the first pope and all that nonsense? But instead, I'm sorry, you guys have to put up with me. Oh man. Forget what I was saying. But by all appearances, when Peter was wrong and corrected, he repented and then walked in a worthy manner. Now, do I think Peter never made another mistake? No. Look at the biblical record of Peter. Do we think that was the last time Peter stuck his foot in his mouth? I seriously doubt it. So could we, if we want to use kind of our modern standard, would anyone want to say that Peter was above reproach? Get behind me, Satan. Like, hello. So I think it's more about your manner of walk, how you respond when corrected. Are you obstinate and hard-hearted and hard-headed, walking in whatever mistake you are? Or when it's shown that you're wrong, do you go, absolutely, okay, I've now rid that from my life?
I tend to view it as if someone is above reproach, there's someone who has earned the benefit of the doubt. And it seems to me that Peter, did he do everything perfectly? No. But when rebuked, he agreed. And so if someone makes a mistake, if there's someone who's above reproach, they'll own up to it. They'll say, "Yep, I did that, and that was wrong. I shouldn't have done that." Or I can understand why people would view this in a particular way, and certainly, we shouldn't want to do that. I think even the not addicted to much wine in the context with Timothy, Paul's telling Timothy to take a little bit of wine for his frequent ailments. I think Timothy was so intent on being above reproach that he was willing to even allow his physical health to be diminished because he didn't want anybody to accuse him of something. And within that same context, he's saying, "Well, no, I'm urging you to take care of yourself and not be so overwhelmed with what people could possibly accuse you of. That, like Timothy, you've earned the benefit of the doubt. You can take care of yourself, and you can do these things that nobody's going to accuse you of being a drunkard. Just don't be a drunkard." But there's a big difference between being a drunkard and being able to do certain things. And so I think Timothy is another example that I agree with. I think Peter was a great example from yours. I think Timothy is someone who maybe went the other direction of being potentially so worried about what other people think that he wasn't really operating in the freedom that he had to even take care of himself, and I think some elders, they become, you live in the fishbowl, so to speak. You're so worried about what everybody's thinking about you and saying about you that you might start to make decisions that could be potentially unhealthy for you in myriad ways. The people that are leading us, the people that we're willing to lay hands on and say, we want these people to be, leading us, they're the type of people that we should be able to extend the benefit of the doubt to, that we shouldn't be, they have to make decisions, and they have to live with the consequences of those decisions. And so we should want to support people, but you don't want to put people who, if you're going to question everything that they're going to do, don't be in that position. But if they have the benefit of the doubt, when someone says, "Hey, you're being, you're harsh, or what you're teaching is inaccurate," do they start, becoming, this pompous, like, "Who do you think you are? I'm so-and-so. You can't say this about me." Or do they exercise some humility and recognize, I'm a person just like everybody else, and I'm capable of making mistakes just like everybody else. And when I make a mistake, I would want to respond just like anybody else. If I'm in the wrong, I should acknowledge that I'm wrong. And I don't think being wrong from time to time, which everybody is, disqualifies you from being above reproach. I think how you respond when you're wrong could potentially disqualify you from being above reproach in the way that I look at it. Other interpretive issues or questions on the qualifications, again, there are a number that we haven't talked about at all, but these are at least the ones that I've seen as kind of more controversial. Is there anything else that you guys would want to bring up? I want to kind of summarize, at the end, but any other qualifications that you guys have got before we kind of say goodbye?
Nope, I'm good.
I think we've covered some good ground, and I'm not sure. Like you said, there's so many more we could touch on, but I think we've touched on the big ones.
Pugnacious.
Pugnacious is an interesting one.
It is.
Yeah. How would you define that? 30 seconds. How would you define pugnacious?
I guess off the cuff, kind of obnoxious and overbearing and kind of Joe-ish, maybe.
Wow, shots fired.
Joe-ish.
Wow.
Yeah, just get kind of this. Yeah, just I don't know. Kind of always. Just got that. Just you've got to do it my way. Oppressive.
A contentious and quarrelsome person.
I think it's related to a word that has come out of use, a pugilist, but someone who is looking
I like that.
looking for a fight. Someone who's always looking
a
for
striker.
a fight. Yeah. So you certainly don't want someone like that who's just looking to fight everybody. That's not a good qualification. So here's my summary. We'll see what you guys think about this, and then we'll close. But I believe that church leadership is incredibly important. I believe that it's important whether you're in leadership or not. If you're a part of the church, you should care about this. I believe that every church does have a singular head, and that's Jesus Christ himself. He's not dead. He's alive. And so he's the one who sets the direction for the body. I also believe that every local church ought to have a plurality of elders, that is at least two, that are going to be faithful under shepherds, under the headship of Christ, to be faithful to lead and exercise authority according to God's word. And it's not about them having their own vision, but to accomplish the things that Christ has given for his people, to equip and to lead and to oversee and faithfully serve. I believe that a body can, but doesn't necessarily have deacons. I don't think that is a necessary aspect of church government, but I do think, especially as the body gets bigger and you have more and more faithful people and more tasks that you're doing, that deacons do become not required, but a very wise addition so that you can protect the elders from being distracted. I think this is one of the biggest problems that we have in modern church leadership, is that we have actually combined the role of elder and deacon into one. We hire a staff member, and then they don't just work hard at preaching and teaching. They don't just work hard at the ministry of the word and the ministry of prayer, but they also wait all the tables, because we've paid them, so they're the one who kind of does everything. Everybody else is a volunteer, so you're the employee, so you're the one who has to get everything done. And I think we have unintentionally, even if it's not on paper, in practice for many people, especially like a singular pastor of a local church, he might have an elder board that he meets with, they might have a deacon board that he's accountable to or that they oversee or something like that. But in practice, light bulbs are burned out, the pastor's the one who's got to change it. The pastor's out there mowing the grass. The pastor's doing everything because he's the paid staff member, and we've mingled those offices together. So ideal situation, actually represent those offices correctly, get some faithful deacons who can kind of take some of this stuff off your plate, serve the body so that the pastor can be free to preach and teach and pray and lead, because they'll give an account for the body that they're overseeing with some other elders. So that's my summary. You guys agree with that? Would you add something to it, take anything away, or you want to just say a uber amen, and then we'll say goodbye for this episode?
Yeah, no, I can agree with that. I can get behind that.
Amen.
Amen. Wow. Well, we did it. If you're still watching, if you have differences of opinion, feel free to let us know. If you agree, you can give us an uber amen down below. It'd be wonderful to see a lot of uber amens down there. Do you think that women can serve as elders? Would be curious if you think why. What about as deacons? Does that seem reasonable to you? How would you define the differences between elders and deacons and all those things? You can comment down and more down below, or you don't have to comment. But until we see you again, get equipped, obey your king, and glorify your God. How you guys doing today?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm fantastic.
Great, fantastic. Eric, can you beat that or?
No.
No. All right.
Not even close.
Yeah.